Startup exits are the most sought-after events in Silicon Valley, but very few people get to experience them. Welcome to the Startup Exits podcast, where we chat with founders that started, ran, and sold a tech company to learn about how it all went down. This podcast is brought to you by Startup Soft.
Hey everybody, this is your host Andrew Vasilik, and you're listening to Startup Exits, where we chat with founders that started, ran, and sold a tech company to learn about how it actually all went down. And today I'm joined by Chris Barton, who is a founder of Shazam. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Shazam is one of the most iconic apps that has ever been built. You guys have over 1 billion downloads, and the company was acquired by Apple in 2017 for $400 million. So just a very, very huge success story. But first, I want to take it back to the early days of the company. And a lot of people think that Shazam was created around the time when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone in 2008. But the reality is that you guys got started 10 years prior. So you had the idea for Shazam in 1999. You put together your original founding team of Philip, Avery, and Dheeraj. And Philip and Dheeraj, you knew very well before you guys got started with Shazam. They were your friends. And there's some people out there that would say that getting into business with friends or family is not a good idea. So my first question to you, what are some of the positive and negative things about being in business with friends?
I definitely don't think that that rule of don't get into business with friends necessarily applies. I think in a way, sometimes a friend is someone that you really know so much better than a sort of just a sort of a social contact or a business contact that can give you a lot of advantages in terms of being able to evaluate whether they would be a good co-founder. Because really, when you're evaluating who your co-founder should be or could be, it's much more than just simply skill set. Because you're creating a company together. It's almost like getting married, and you're gonna basically not only make decisions together, but you want to know, how well you work together, how well you, how you handle disagreements, and what you're kind of driving, what really drives you as a person, what's important to you. Things like integrity was a big one for me in terms of it was a quality that was extremely important. And that's something I think that you can have a better sense for someone's integrity when they're a close friend than when you just have had business interactions with them, for example. So in a way, I actually think that if a friend has the right skill set, and sort of that can mean complementary skills or strengths in some way to what you have, and then they can be a great co-founder. So that's kind of how I thought through that, selecting friends as co-founders.
I could definitely see how being prior friends with your co-founders could help, especially at some of the low points in the company, and I would imagine it would also strengthen your friendship with them as well. There was a point very early on in Shazam's history where you guys had a business meeting, and during that meeting, you guys were quite secretive about revealing all the information about the Shazam idea that you guys had at that time. And I feel like there's some founders out there that have a similar approach where they're secretive about their idea. In your opinion, do you think that secrecy is a good thing? And if not, what would you say to founders to help them overcome this need for secrecy?
I think that, I think you can, well, let's put it this way. I think being secretive is not extremely harmful, but if you're overly secretive, it can actually hold you back in really gathering the right input and insights for your business. So I think there's a balance. I think the opposite of being secretive would be putting up a website saying here's what my business is going to do, and maybe even getting some press and so on. And then you're kind of, you're right, your concept is sort of much more widely available or broadcast to the world. Whereas I think kind of a nice balance is to be somewhat open about at least big parts of your idea with the people that you think might give you some meaningful feedback, and those people could be a lot of people. It's not just a very small number that are under maybe an NDA with you, but it could be friends or people that you know well in the industry, or even people you don't know well but that are experts in the industry, and you can get some quite valuable feedback and insights from those people. And if you're trying to be super secretive, you may not be able to get to the point of getting that feedback or getting those insights because you're sort of reticent to share the idea. So I guess my view is there's a balance, and definitely being overly secretive, I think, can hold you back in terms of getting the learnings that you need in those early days. Does that answer the question? So yeah, so we were actually quite secretive with the Shazam idea because we thought it was pretty novel, and we wanted, to get a sort of a head start and kind of trying to conquer the technological hurdles to sort of support this concept. But we did share it obviously with the people that, so we were out meeting with PhDs in audio signal processing, asking if they could invent a technology like this. And obviously with those people we had to share the idea. And essentially that means we're sharing the idea with the exact people that have the talents to invent it, essentially. But we didn't think it made sense to sort of literally enter into NDAs with each one and really be overly protective.
So you spoke about some of the tech hurdles that you guys had to overcome. And when you guys were getting started, there was nothing out there that could identify a song based on audio that was playing. So you guys had to literally invent the technology, which is incredible. And once you guys did invent the technology, you went on to raise your angel round, and you raised the round by cold emailing investors. And I want to say that's a bit of a non-traditional way of raising capital, in the sense that most people nowadays, they try to get intros, they try to go to their network. Do you feel that cold emailing investors is still a viable way of raising capital in 2019?
Honestly, I'm not. It would be hard for me to assess which method is sort of most effective, just because I've only had the kind of one experience. But I guess I sort of had my own built-in philosophy of how I wanted to raise capital for Shazam. Definitely the much more standard way is what you're describing, especially in places where there's a lot of seed level investors or angel investors, for example. So this, that way is just, it's almost like a shotgun approach. You're just sort of going out there trying to find really anyone that's interested in making investments, early stage investments, and you're out pitching your idea to them, and to get in front of them, obviously referrals can be very helpful, because that's how a lot of them screen is basically they only want to meet with the companies that are kind of referred by someone they trust. We were in the UK, so we started Shazam in London, and so definitely the UK does not have the extensive angel network out there that you find in Silicon Valley. So that was one thing. So there wasn't just things like Angel List, and there were no people known as super angels, it just wasn't like a common concept. This concept of angel investing. So that was one factor that played into our decision on our approach. But more importantly, I just felt that there's a bunch of reasons why I would like to raise money from kind of very specifically targeted individuals. And those individuals were basically people that had a very strong expertise or background related to what my startup was in. And so since Shazam was basically music and mobile phones and technology, essentially it was people like that, people that had either strong backgrounds in music or strong backgrounds in music technology or mobile technology. And so I just thought that if we target those types of people, that would be the best type of investor for several reasons. One is that, if they invested it would provide validation on the business. And actually that turned out to be very important. In fact, my Series A venture capitalist even said that one of the most compelling things about our pitch deck was the fact that the angel investors we had were pretty high profile individuals in the music industry. And then secondly, you're resonating with them, because when an angel investor makes an investment, I think there's two big reasons they want to make the investment, and one of them is their passion for the area. And so by targeting, like for example, music, big music industry experts and so on, they can resonate with the Shazam concept because it's something that they understand and they're passionate about music. Plus, the second thing is that I think they want to have almost an unfair advantage as an investor, and the unfair advantage comes from their deep expertise and knowledge. And so if they invest in something that they know a lot about, they can then steer the chances of your success, and therefore have this unfair advantage in their investment, essentially steering the path of their investment. So I guess those are the primary reasons. And so but to find those individuals, we didn't have directly or indirectly through our network contacts that were sort of big senior executives in the music industry. So I just decided to basically cold email them, and it turned out it worked. We got the former chairman and CEO of EMI, one of the major labels, the former chairman of BMG in the UK, another one of the major labels, the founder of Liquid Audio, which was a public company in music technology at the time. So a variety of, and the former chief technology officer of British Telecom, who was obviously close to the whole telecom space. So those are all angel investors in Shazam, and so the method did work.
On the topic of raising capital, you guys raised your Series A in 2001, which was in the middle of a huge global financial crisis, the dot-com crash. And there's some people out there that are speculating that we're on a brink of another crisis. Usually these things happen every 10 years or so, and it's been roughly 10 years since the last one. What sort of advice would you give to founders that are running a startup, either in the middle of a financial crisis, or what can they do to prepare for one?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we definitely started Shazam basically essentially right, as you mentioned, right after the crash. And looking back, I mean, that made some things really difficult. So there's no doubt that raising capital was extremely hard to do. Most the venture capitalists that we pitched to told us that they were not investing in anything that was B2C. They viewed B2C as much higher risk than B2B, which I think it generally is. And we were definitely B2C. And then they were frankly really fighting fires for their portfolio companies, trying to keep those companies alive. So not really making a lot of investments at all. So it was a pretty challenging time. But then on the other hand, there's sort of advantages, I think, to running a startup in those difficult times. Obviously, assuming you do solve the problem of getting capital, which we did through just simply perseverance and determination, then a lot of other things become much better for you. So, I mean, recruiting obviously can be better because there's more talent on the market that's available, and that can be really frustrating in times like really good times when all the talent gets vacuumed up by Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. And then other things were more affordable. I remember we took over the office spaces of one of the imploded .coms, and even bought all their chairs and tables and so on for pennies on the dollar. And so, that was helpful for us as a business. That would have been tougher for us in boom times. And then I would say sort of even competition. If you can be less concerned about competition, both from other startups as well as large companies that are also having to prioritize their focus on kind of the near-term revenue opportunities. And so you can just kind of hunker down and focus on building your startup. And I think that kind of the time aspect of urgency has a little bit less pressure, and the competitive aspect has less pressure because of how everyone is sort of distracted by the tough times. So that allows you more time to build your business in a thoughtful way, because things do take time, especially when you're limited on capital. So having more time can be to your advantage. I mean, I guess my main advice for entrepreneurs in difficult times is just keep thinking outside the box on how can you build your business with less capital, and how can you find, that includes finding early revenue, that includes doing things in a less expensive way, that includes doing less, or taking more time to do things, but just constantly thinking about that capital efficiency. And that will give you, that was your biggest advantage in difficult times.
So you mentioned perseverance, and you guys essentially overcame a lot of hurdles. So anything from inventing the technology to raising in a financial crisis to launching. So you guys persevered through a lot of difficult times in the company. And you also speak in other interviews that perseverance is one of the most important skill sets for founders to have. And it's one of the biggest things for entrepreneurial success. But I feel like on the other side of things, sometimes it's equally important to know when to let go. So where do you draw the line? Like, how do you know when is it worth it to keep on pushing through versus when is it better to just pretty much throw in the towel?
Yeah, that's a really good question, I have to say. I mean, because, ultimately, you could easily, be sort of so focused on being perseverant on something that really you're never going to get there, and therefore you're just wasting, months or years of time. And so I think, ultimately it's just, honestly, it's sort of just a judgment issue. You're really, it's a combination. Yeah, it's judgment where you're basically deciding, is your goal achievable? And also, is that goal mission critical for where you're trying to go? And so, if it's mission critical, I'll give a great example. If you look at the early days of Dropbox, one thing that they persevered on, and in fact, they continued to persevere on for many years after that, but certainly in the early days, was really conquering synchronization, of documents between a device and the cloud. And they did that because they really believed that synchronization, if they conquered it and made it incredibly reliable, then they would create this sort of seamless experience with the cloud that would be so much better than having to just upload things and then download things. That was a really, really hard problem to tackle, really hard. And they've had to prioritize it by putting most of their engineering talent on solving that one problem. But I think they recognize that they should not give up on that, because that would be their kind of core to really breaking through and having something that was so much better than everyone else. So I think that's sort of an example of where you're recognizing that a goal is so mission critical that you just don't want to give up on it. And that was true also for Shazam, for music recognition, for just identifying a song in a noisy environment, and just being laser focused on that. But on the other hand, there could be other things that companies try to do that just simply it may not be so mission critical, or you might recognize that this is just not gonna work out. It's just not feasible. It's just going to take too long. Sometimes those are things that involve reliance on partners, by the way, which can take sometimes years and be very uncertain. And on some of those things, I think sometimes you have to throw in the towel and just realize that your business you're never going to get there even if you keep on trying. It's just going to take years, and you're just going to need to find another way. So it really is all down to judgment.
So another very critical thing for startups is timing. And some startups start too late. When they get into a market, there's already a lot of competition. Some start too early, where maybe there's not the infrastructure, the required infrastructure is not available yet. In the case of Shazam, it seemed like you guys were way ahead of your time. So you mentioned in one interview that if you guys started the company 5 years later, you would have had a much easier time. How do you approach timing? Like, how do you know when is it too late to enter a particular market? When is it too early? Or when is it just the right time?
That's a great question. I think that, again, I think it comes down to judgment. I mean, as a startup, I think you want to be just a little bit ahead of your time, because if you're a little bit ahead of your time, that means you're kind of getting started on solving something that's going to be extremely relevant to the world. But you're getting started on it before it really is solved by either another startup or the incumbent large companies in the world. So you do want to be a little bit ahead of your time so that you can have that advantage, so that you sort of have something, you have some technology or offering that is really relevant at the time that the kind of hockey stick of relevancy becomes applicable for the market that you're going for. And hopefully you're right that really will happen, that there will be this sort of hockey stick of relevancy. But if you're too far ahead of your time, and actually it turned out that we were too far ahead of our time, and I'm talking about many years, because Shazam launched, we were starting Shazam, as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we were starting Shazam a full 8 years before the iPhone came out, and 7 to 8 years, and 8 to 9 years ahead of the App Store coming out. And I think we didn't realize that, it wasn't until the App Store came that there would really be a big market for something like Shazam. And we were counting on the fact that the just mobile phones themselves, even without apps, would be a sufficient market for us, which it turned out was not the case. So when you're way too far ahead of your time, obviously it's just very hard to survive for that many years before you start to see traction. You really don't have that much time in startups typically. You have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 years, depending on how good you are at capital preservation. So I guess again it's judgment, and you're essentially having to predict the future and say when is this all going to happen, and we knew a lot of things were coming in mobile, like 3G and color phones and the early versions of apps like Java and Brew and so on. But I think we didn't quite understand how long it would take before there was a real breakthrough to the masses in terms of doing all these advanced things on mobile phones.
Yeah, and I think if you take a look at your initial vision for Shazam, which was essentially to make audio clickable, just as links to websites are clickable, and not just for music, but as well as TV shows and movies, this sort of vision would not be possible on computers, and it's only possible on something that people carry with them everywhere they go, such as smartphones. So in some ways, you guys predicted, and you guys were banking on mobile becoming huge, and this is, again, 10 years before mobile actually did become huge. So do you have any sort of predictions for, let's say, the next 10, 20 years as far as what sort of industries, what sort of technologies do you expect to become huge?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked that question a lot. I often think I'm not one of the best people to answer it. I think just because I tend to be, as an entrepreneur, I tend to, pick areas and then zoom in on those and rather than become a generalist, like a venture capitalist who's looking at a lot of things and a lot of trends and seeing so many pitches and stories that they can start to pick up on signals of what's coming. So I wouldn't say I'm the best person to give an answer, but I guess I can give you just sort of my answer anyway for what it's worth, which is the area that I'm particularly fascinated by in terms of massive impact is essentially artificial intelligence, machine learning, which is obviously one of the big trends. But I do think that that there'll be one by one a lot of businesses that will be significantly impacted and even create opportunities for new products and new startups and so on that solve problems really well through essentially employing artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's definitely a category that I'm very excited about, and I think will create some significant change in the coming years.
I want to switch gears to Shazam's acquisition. The company was acquired by Apple in 2017. It was a $400 million deal. Can you share with us about how it actually went down?
Yeah, so I think we at Shazam, I think we're ready for sort of an exit. As you mentioned, a lot of startups are sort of seeking that exit, and keep in mind that Shazam, when it did exit, it was a good 18 years from when we started the company. We sometimes like to joke that we were always 2 years away from exit, and during that 18-year period. But so we did start to engage on, and again, as you can imagine, I have to. I can only talk about so much with regards to this process, but we did engage in conversations with a variety of companies that we thought were complementary to Shazam around the world. And as you might imagine, they're also just very large technology companies. So you can sort of imagine who some of those companies would be. Knowing that Shazam's core businesses really were music related and advertising related. That's because advertising is how we made our money, and we were doing some pretty innovative things in advertising in terms of interactions with advertisements, as well as we were doing lots of great stuff in music, and we're a significant influencer of music discovery. So those were two common themes for areas that were often of interest to these large prospective buyers of companies. And really, we just, with the assistance of some really talented advisors, we engaged in a very thoughtful process of communicating our vision and our the strategic advantages that we brought to the table, the kind of the business that we had built, which included a very large base of users that were very and a big brand, and users, most importantly, that I think were really delighted by Shazam. Shazam would consistently get very, very high ratings in the App Store, even relative to some of the top apps that you can think of that are used today. So we really focused heavily on delighting our users, and so I think we built a big brand. As you mentioned, over 1 billion downloads of Shazam, and consistently we're getting more than 8 million, I think, new downloads, new users basically downloading Shazam every month. So just a nice consistent growth. And so bringing all those things together, we basically just were looking for the right partner that would really find Shazam complementary to their business, and one that we felt like we'd fit well into. And I'd say I couldn't be happier with the outcome. I mean, obviously Apple is a company that also focuses on delighting users, and also as a brand that's loved by a large number of people, both in technology and in music. And obviously they're a major player in music, up there with Spotify and streaming, and they were definitely the global leader in digital music before the world of streaming with iTunes. So just very complimentary to Shazam. So that was the process, and it was a very lengthy process. I think when I think about it, I mean, it was more than from kind of kicking off that kind of process of thinking about where we fit best, until the final conclusion would have been significantly more than a year. But part of that is because of the lengthy regulatory process that we went through on the acquisition. Nowadays, the European Union often carefully scrutinize acquisitions, particularly by large companies such as Google and Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and so on. So that definitely drew things out a bit. But yeah, it was. We had some great conversations during that process, and really some significant deep dives with several prospective companies that it could have worked out with. But I definitely think that I couldn't dream of a better outcome than Apple.
So you mentioned that besides Apple, you guys were in talks with a few other companies as well. What would you say to founders that are running a startup, they're doing pretty well, and they start getting approached by corporate dev people with acquisition talks from larger companies? Are these meetings worth taking? Are they a waste of time? Or do you kind of gauge based on readiness level of the startup to get acquired? What sort of advice would you give to people in this position?
I mean, I don't think it's a waste of time. I think it's good for you as a founder to always know, just be aware. You need to know your market, really. And you should be, even if you're years away from where you think you want to exit, and maybe you're planning to go IPO one day, you really would be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't always know that kind of the market for your, the asset that you control, your company. And the only way to keep your kind of finger on the pulse of what that looks like is to maintain, I think, some kind of ongoing correspondence and interactions with the key players in the space, and those you often facilitated through the corporate development folks. But not only, by the way, are they kind of facilitated through that, but obviously, to the extent that you have commercial relationships with these companies, that also is another way of kind of cozying up. I mean, just as an example, Shazam obviously did a lot of things with Apple in the years leading up to the acquisition. We were a big driver of iTunes affiliate sales, and we did lots of stuff in the App Store, and premiering their new technologies and so on things like the iPad and the Apple Watch and you name it. So I think again, as a founder, I think it's good to stay close, and you might get some level of interest or even potential offers for your company, and it doesn't mean that you need to do a deep dive and really take them seriously. But it's good to again be aware of them and really only engage when at the time that you think there's one that could be of interest. And you hear about those courtings. Like I think the Instagram sale, that was basically Mark Zuckerberg really courting Kevin Systrom, from what I understand, just reading in the press, for quite a long time, and led to a very significant acquisition. So again, you just don't know where those things are going to go, and so I think it's good to be open.
Founders are always told to have an exit strategy, even in ridiculously early stages, like they're raising a pre-seed. Did you guys have an exit strategy? And if you did, was Apple ever in your sights?
Yeah, I mean, I think exit strategy is a funny thing to say because it makes it sound like you can kind of control your exit, and I think that people can misunderstand what that really means. In my mind, there's really just two main things that you can do, and all they are doing is really sort of optimizing the opportunity for your exit. You definitely don't control your exit unless you go IPO. And then optimizing your opportunity for exit through M&A, which is obviously more common than IPO. So it's definitely the one that I think that all founders should be very, very aware of as a form of exit. I think the two main things are to be just building a great product, a great business, and great relationships with your customers, and be very laser focused on that, because that is one thing that ultimately makes you attractive to a prospective buyer. And then the second thing is as I said, sort of forming closer relationships with some of the companies that may one day be a buyer, and because sometimes it's that close relationship. It could be a core partnership of some type that is complementary to both parties, but often it's those that allow you to get to know the people and allow the prospective buyer to get to know your company and your product and your technology well enough that it becomes sort of interest to them, to potentially completely to own that. So I think that thinking through, as a founder, who are the companies out there that are most likely to see value in owning you one day, and why would they see value in owning you one day? And then thinking through, how can you potentially kind of get to know those companies really well today? Is there something you can start doing with them today? And that would be, again, mutually beneficial. So not because you can only distract yourself so much. I think that's probably the next best thing you can do after the first thing I mentioned, which is just continuing to build great products, great business, and great relationships with your customers.
So my last question to you, Chris, is a bit of a funky one. You're, of course, big into music. Shazam is all about music, and Apple, as you mentioned, is a big player in music. Is there any song or artist that you associate with Shazam? It could be in the early days of the company, maybe during the time that you guys launched, or around the acquisition, or at any point of the company at all. Is there any particular song or artist that you associate with Shazam?
Yeah, I guess the first company, it's the first band name that comes to mind for some reason, is the Pixies. And it's not that it's necessarily one of my favorite bands. I mean, I think they're there's some other bands that would be my favorite bands. But there was just quite a fun, sort of funny story that where their music threw us for a loop a little bit in our early days when we were developing our technology for commercial launch, and it was leading to some essentially false positives, where we were getting an issue where for one of our investors, every song that he Shazammed, it would come back, no matter what he Shazammed, it would come back and say it's the Pixies, and it became like almost a joke because it really only happened to him. But it turned out that there was a certain sort of feedback sound in one of their songs that that match the feedback sound you hear when you put your mobile phone right up next to a speaker and create a feedback loop. And that was creating this false positive. And this particular investor was doing that. He was so keen for it to work leading up to the commercial launch that every time he Shazammed a song, he would literally walk right up to the speaker and put his phone essentially right next to it, causing that feedback sound. We solved that problem later, but anyway, for that reason, that band always kind of is the one that comes to mind when I think of those early days of Shazam.
So as we're getting ready to wrap up here, Chris, tell us about what you have going on in your life now, and if you have any plans for starting another startup in the future.
Oh yeah, I actually did decide that this is it's long been my dream. After working for many years since Shazam, working for many years at Google and Dropbox, that I really wanted to start another company. And my goals are quite different than they were with Shazam. I'm not trying to build a huge company that raises lots of venture capital money and is going to be $1 billion company, but I do want to do. It's a little bit more mission driven or impact driven. But I'm excited to be working on it, and I have been for about 9 months now. And it's a very early stage. It's really just me at this stage. But yeah, I'm focused on computer vision as a technology enabling my startup. And so it's sort of incubation stage as to exactly how it's going to play out. So I won't get into too much more detail. But it's definitely exciting to be starting from the ground up and working towards creating something. I really enjoy that kind of creative process.
Well, let's hope it's another success so we can have you back on the show. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Chris. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and share it with your friends. Also tag a founder you'd like to see on the show. This podcast is brought to you by Startup Soft. To learn more, visit startupsoft.org.